don't want to write a romance, but I may not have a choice. That's a bit of a misleading hook to get you to watch the video, but what I mean is there is a burgeoning conversation happening around Romantasy, that spicy magical new genre blend that has popped up in recent years and been largely responsible for knocking nonfiction off of its throne as the top earning piece of the bookseller pie. Folks who exist in bookish social media spaces are engaging in heated conversations as authors and readers alike try to define Romantasy. Is it a new genre, like when Mary Shelley invented science fiction, or is it a trend that will wax and wane in popularity, like stories about witches or zombies or vampires? If you're approaching this conversation as a romance reader or writer, you are naturally quite defensive and protective of the genre. Romance has long been looked down upon by writers and readers from other genres, despite being far and away the most lucrative slice of the fiction pie, a slice so large you could basically fit all the other slices in it and still have extra pie. Romance makes a lot of money, and as such, I've seen a refrain that writers want romance dollars without paying the happily ever after tax. That's where people are getting rather upset recently. For a book to be shelved as capital R romance, it must adhere to the strict rule that the book ends in a happily ever after, or at least a happily for now. The protagonist and their love interest must survive the events of the book, end up together, and live on after the story ends. If you have a romantic story like Song of Achilles or something by Nicholas Sparks that does not have a happy ending, that gets shelved in other places, such as historical fiction or the nebulous women's fiction. I'll admit I don't really know what women's fiction means because we don't have a men's fiction as far as I'm aware, and it kind of sounds demeaning, but I'm not a woman, so I digress. The problem as far as the public discourse goes is that there has been no collective decision as to whether Romantasy is an offshoot of romance or fantasy, or if it's a whole new thing. That's a very important distinction because readers need to be accurately marketed to. You need to be able to confidently pick up a book on a shelf and mostly know what you're getting into. If something is marketed as a subgenre of romance, it must have a happily ever after, and many reviewers, writers, and readers coming to the conversation insist Romantasy abide by strict happy ending conventions. However, if it is being marketed as a subgenre of fantasy, anything could happen. The protagonist could get their head lopped off in the penultimate chapter. The love interest could turn into the villain. However, what I'd like to do is provide another side to this discourse and remind people of the unsavory fact that all of this is a business. See, on its surface, enjoyers of the arts don't like to think about the graphs and charts and budgets of it all, but when it comes to traditional publishing, you have to understand a few things. Most authors don't earn out their advance, meaning the publisher doesn't sell enough copies to recoup the money they paid the author, and therefore the author never earns royalties. Those extra books are either filtered through discount stores or literally destroyed to make room for new books, and the cycle repeats. When publishers stumble upon a cash cow, they want to milk it for all it's worth, and that comes in the way of realigning buying and editorial decisions to skew towards the new trend. Or basically, they want to shove as many books into the hot category as they possibly can before the trend dies down. We've seen this before. When vampires were hot, an author might present a ghost story and an acquisitions editor might say, "The writing is great, but couldn't these ghosts be vampires?" And if the author says no, they might very well end their chance at selling that book. If they say yes, suddenly a writer of ghost stories must figure out a way to rewrite a vampire story. What is happening behind the scenes that you may not be aware of is that if you write stories, particularly fantasy stories, aimed at a YA bookshelf right now, publishers are telling authors to find a way to make it romantasy. Pump up the romance, inject some spice, but it's gone further than that, as entire presses are now telling their editors to retool their acquisition to exclusively buy something that can sit on a Romantasy bookshelf. If you want to write the next Wizard of Earthsea, The Dark is Rising, or Coraline, editors are asking, where is the love interest? Where is the romance? That leaves authors trying to find a way to authentically tell the stories we want to tell and market them to readers who won't feel angry because they were marketed a book in a way that doesn't actually fit into the genre. If a book is pitched as Red, White, and Royal Blue meets Game of Thrones and is about two princes from warring nations who unexpectedly fall in love while trying to find a way to bring peace to the land, that can sound really intriguing on its surface, but when the business side of things gets involved, certain questions have to be answered. Where is it shelved? Who are the readers? Red, White, and Royal Blue is a contemporary romance that meets all of the typical conventions. It has a happily ever after. The leads are protected. If a reader sees that tagline and comes to the book thinking they're getting a romance, they want the security of knowing the outcome. Readers of Game of Thrones, however, will value the unease of knowing anyone, even the person you think is the protagonist, can suddenly get their head lopped off. Publisher will really want to put that book in this new Romantasy section. But if one of the leads dies and Romantasy is an offshoot of romance, not fantasy, then lots of readers are going to be quite mad. That's a marketing problem, a publishing problem, not necessarily a storytelling problem. It isn't an author's nefarious intent to cash in, it's a capitalist publisher putting dollars over readers. The one thing you need to know is that in traditional publishing, everything moves very slow. It's almost impossible to be a traditionally published author and cash in on a trend because we have no idea what's going to be popular with readers a year or two from now, which is when a book would come out if it sold tomorrow. Authors, new and old, best-selling or mid-list, are all dealing with a new landscape where a very slow industry is suddenly trying to keep up with the latest social media-driven trends. I started off in publishing as a poet, and if you think romance is fiercely protected, undervalued, looked down upon by publishers, and generally disdained by society at large, try being a poet. It's the same crap without any of the money. Poetry has gone through the same exact discourse time and again. When insta-poetry revived the genre for a new generation, making stars of Rupi Kaur, R.H. Sen, and Amanda Lovelace, we got to have this conversation. The old guard of poetry said this wasn't poetry. It didn't adhere to conventions. Yet for the first time in a very long time, publishers found a cash cow in a genre where a successful print run previously meant selling 500 to 1,000 copies. Suddenly you could sell thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions. And now, aspiring and established poets alike are asked to make their poems shorter, more inviting and accessible. And if we could include line art illustrations to accompany the poems, that would be great. Even poet laureate Billy Collins acquiesced to publishing trends and put out a collection that could sit alongside insta-poets. However, poetry is also celebratory of innovation. The Pulitzer Prize was awarded to Diane Seuss's collection of sonnets, despite the fact that it did not adhere to strict sonnet rhyming conventions. Many people loved the pushing of boundaries, and still others lambasted it as not only not adhering to conventions, but not being poetry at all. Romance authors and readers alike have every reason to be protective. They've spent a very long time being looked down upon, as happens with anything created by and marketed primarily to women. Yet suddenly they're the cool kids at the table. And that means more attention and success than the genre has previously enjoyed, which is saying a lot because it has made a lot of money for a very long time. But as new genres emerge or get combined, especially when they're wildly profitable, the people with the real power, publishers, are forcing authors to have to ask questions they never thought they'd have to ask. It is important that everyone along the publishing route, from acquisitions to copy editors to marketers to readers, all be made crystal clear what a book is and, more importantly, isn't about. That requires an understanding of the current language of readers, of trend and the distinction of genre, and, if possible, a little bit of grace as authors are being shoehorned into spaces by publishers looking to make money. Publishers who are very happy if you and I are fighting, because that means nobody's going to be criticizing them. Hope this helps.